We have to use this little mic for the recording that they're doing, so it's a little bit awkward, but we're going to try and pass it back and forth. So thank you for that introduction, Allison. I'm Aviva. I am the senior archaeologist at Musqueam. As Allison spoke to, my role is varied. It takes different forms day to day. Sometimes I'm in the field, a lot of the times I'm not. I'm in meetings with various levels of government and with other First Nations. I like to think of my role as really looking at or being focused on two different things. One is to listen and learn from Musqueam and to take direction, and to use that direction to help manage the heritage that's in Musqueam territory in a way that's respectful to Musqueam and to the way that the landscape has been used for millennia since time immemorial. And I'll turn it over to Ginevra.
Hi, I'm Ginevra, and I am the Archaeology and Cultural Heritage Program Manager at Tsleil-Waututh. And as Allison said, I'm Aviva's counterpart over at Tsleil-Waututh. A lot of you may have noticed that Aviva and I are not First Nations ourselves. We're hired by the nations in a technical capacity to provide expertise in cultural heritage management, and we're able to speak on behalf of the nations in matters related to archaeology and cultural heritage. One of our goals through both of our positions working with Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh is to increase the capacity at both of the nations and basically work ourselves out of a job. We want there to be Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh people managing heritage resources in our positions.
So today we're going to take you through one particular project that we're working on together. We collaborate a lot on a lot of big picture projects. This project we're talking about today is a project in which together we're working to establish sovereignty over Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh's archaeological and cultural heritage resources. For the archaeologists in the room, this isn't a surprise, but for all of the non-archaeologists, it's probably surprising to you to know that First Nations in BC do not have legislative control over their own heritage, over their own village sites, over their own ancestral burials. That's held, that control is held by provincial powers, and so we're going to talk about that and about the nuances around that. So we're getting around this and working to redefine how heritage is managed and what heritage means, and making strides in trying to help Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh govern their own heritage. And this is just this presentation focuses on one of those ways. We're going to take you through quite a bit of information. A lot of it's, we're going to take you through a bit about the archaeology and then get into very big picture things. So stick with us. So Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh are two of the three major First Nations in the Lower Mainland, the other one being Squamish, who we collaborate with quite a bit as well. They unfortunately couldn't be here today because of capacity issues. All of the First Nations struggle from capacity issues. We are overloaded with projects and overworked and understaffed. So that's something we struggle with all the time. Musqueam are fishing peoples. They speak Hunkaminam, which is one of the languages that's part of the continuum of Hunkaminam, Halkamalem, Hulkaminam languages. They are very tied to the Fraser, and instead of telling you about them, I'll read a statement from the Musqueam website. The Humusqueam people have been here as long as there has been land to live upon. We have lived in the area of our present location for thousands of years, and our traditional territory occupies what is now Vancouver and surrounding areas. Some of our Squiem, or ancient stories, describe the landscape as it was over 8,000 years ago. The name Musqueam relates back to the flowering plant, muthqui, which grows in the Fraser River estuary. There is a Squiem that has been passed on from generation to generation that explains how we became known as Humusqueam, the people of the muthqui plant. And that story goes, the old people spoke of a small lake called Humumquem, which is now known as Camosun Bog, where the Seithke, or the double-headed serpent, originated. They were warned as youth to be cautious and to not go near or they would surely die. This Saiske was so massive, its winding path from the lake to the Stallo, to the river, became the creek flowing through Musqueam to this day. Everything the serpent passed over died, and from its droppings bloomed a new plant, Muthqui. For this reason, the people long ago named that place Humusqueam, Musqueam, place of the Muthqui. And I'll turn it over to Ginevra to talk about Tsleil-Waututh.
Thanks. I'm actually just going to read a little bit of an excerpt out of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation Stewardship Policy, which is a document that guides how Tsleil-Waututh stewards the land and its resources. We are Tsleil-Waututh First Nation, people of the inlet. We have lived in and along our inlet since time out of mind. We have been here since the Creator transformed the wolf into that first Tsleil-Waututh and made the wolf responsible for this land. We have always been here and we always will be here. Our people are here to care for our land and water. It is our obligation and birthright to be the caretakers and protectors of our inlet. We know where we come from and we know who we are. We respect our heritage and nothing can change our history and our truth.
Yeah. So now that you know who we're talking about, we're going to situate you geographically. So as Allison mentioned in her lovely introduction, we are on UBC campus is situated right in the core territory of the Musqueam peoples. As Allison also mentioned, all of the Lower Mainland is unceded territory, and it's really important that we take a second to think about that word and understand what that means. It's said a lot in acknowledgements and in openings for events, but there's not a lot of time taken to think about what that means. And what that means is that the land was never given up, turned over, sold, or bargained for by First Nations people. And so legally, that means that this land that we're on belongs to First Nations people. Their rights were never given up. So Musqueam territory, as it looks like today, is that picture on the left there. I'm not going to get too much into why there's a red boundary and a blue boundary, but the red boundary is where Musqueam people were living, had villages located. This is considered, it's been called core territory, that we're trying to get away from those terms. And the blue boundary extends out quite a bit further and shows, the places people were traveling to hunt, to fish, to get other resources. So it encompasses all of the Lower Mainland, most of the suburbs, and it overlaps with Tsleil-Waututh's territory, which Ginevra will talk about.
So this is Tsleil-Waututh consultation area. The way that we got to this boundary was by talking to all of the living Tsleil-Waututh people to ask them where on the landscape they have lived, where they've hunted, where they've set up camp, where they've harvested different types of food. And the result of that was a lot of dots on the map, and the boundary was drawn around that to determine where a Tsleil-Waututh consultation area is. The boundary itself is very colonial in nature. Traditionally, Tsleil-Waututh people, probably all First Nations, weren't really thinking about their traditional territory being bound by a line. Traditional territories were where you lived, where you gathered foods, and access to resources was built based on relationships with other First Nations. So, Tsleil-Waututh and Musqueam have a very close relationship, many family ties. Tsleil-Waututh would be allowed to come down to the Fraser River to fish for salmon, and Musqueam would be allowed to come up to the Indian River watershed to hunt. And so there was no boundaries traditionally. It was just traditional ways of life and relationships between all the different First Nations that share this area. So going from the traditional territories, very expansive areas, and then looking at where Tsleil-Waututh and Musqueam are situated today, which is on very small reserves. Tsleil-Waututh has their main reserve on the North Shore in North Vancouver along Dollarton Highway, and that's where most of the Tsleil-Waututh people live today. And there's also another smaller reserve at the mouth of the Indian River in the northern orange star there. The red dots are traditional village sites that existed before European contact, and some of the reserves may have lined up with where the traditional villages were before, but a lot of the times they didn't. So people were just kind of like plucked from their traditional territories and like put on, plucked from their villages and put on a new land that they weren't used to living before.
Similarly to Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam have 3 reserves now, actually. There were 4 up until the 1950s. The 4th one at the south end of the Patello Bridge, where there's a traditional village spot there known as Kakite. Now only one of these reserves is lived in, the most northern one, which is Musqueam's primary community just outside of UBC. If you've never been there, feel free to come visit. I lived probably most of my adult life in Vancouver without realizing that it was there. And it is there, and it's a vibrant community. It feels very separate from the city in a lot of ways, but we really welcome visitors to come and to have a look and, you know, to understand a little bit more about who the people are. Musqueam have about 1,400 members now, 700 of which live on reserve, so quite a large community.
So just to give you some background about how Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh people lived in the past, they had a reciprocal relationship with the environment around them. They were considered very rich people because of the amount of resources that were available to them. Tsleil-Waututh has a saying, when the tide goes out, the table was set. And what that means is that when the tide goes out, all of these clams you can harvest, there's crabs available, oysters, mussels, just an abundance of food that, you know, within 15 minutes or so, you'd be able to feed your whole family. I've also heard other stories about the abundance of fish in the rivers. The fish were so abundant that during the salmon runs, you could actually walk across the fish's back to get from one side of the river to the other. Old growth cedars, tons of places for people to harvest resources. The waterways were the main highways for people in canoes to get around. And I think there's a bit of a misconception about First Nations people that they were hunters and gatherers, that life was primitive, but that's not the case at all. These were huge civilizations with populations in the tens of thousands in the Vancouver area. They had people that were engineers, scientists, lawyers, doctors, that didn't just come from post-contact. They had those professions before European contact and were just a lively civilization. After European contact, there were a lot of impacts, negative impacts from the contact and development. Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh people being located in Vancouver area literally watched the city grow around them. And then they're corralled and put on these very tiny reserves. Diseases decimated the population. So, the original populations before contact in the tens of thousands. I've heard Tsleil-Waututh people talk about their populations went down to 30. Just crazy decimation from disease and war. Kids were plucked up and taken to residential schools, and I think that the horrors of residential schools have been becoming more public in recent years. And there's a long list of prohibitions. So people weren't able to leave the reserve without the permission of the Indian agent, which means that they couldn't visit their kids in residential schools for sometimes the whole time they were in residential school. There was prohibitions against speaking the traditional languages, practicing culture, having potlatches. It's just a long line. And then at the same time, settlers that are moving here to this new land, are preempting land. There was a law about, it was really easy to buy land if you were going to use it for like agriculture or something, and so growing potatoes was really cheap, so people did that often. There's actually a few instances where ancestral human remains, First Nations grave sites, are being excavated for people to plant potatoes there. And that's actually something that still happens today, minus the potatoes, but with development, quite often you're coming across an archaeological site that maybe you didn't know was there, maybe there's ancestral remains there, and those are being excavated and removed to secondary location. And the reason that is, that still happens is because First Nations cemeteries are not considered cemeteries, they're considered burial grounds, and they're considered archaeological sites. And so a lot of negative impacts resulted in immense loss in culture and intergenerational trauma, which First Nations people are still really trying to heal from today. But nations are very resilient. So despite all that really terrible things that have happened since colonization, there's a revival of culture. People are starting to speak the traditional languages again. The populations are increasing, so Aviva mentioned about 1,400 Musqueam people. There's about 600 Tsleil-Waututh folks, so populations are steadily increasing. The Vancouver area is very archaeologically rich, and I mean that's due to the amount of activity and the amount of people that were here before in villages and with all the resource harvesting areas and spiritual sites, and the archaeology is just a small remnant of what is what's preserved from all of that activity. If we looked, you'll notice that most of the archaeological sites are actually like in green spaces, and so within parks, and that's not to say that there's not archaeological sites elsewhere, but just that development has most likely destroyed archaeological sites in other areas, and in park spaces there's relatively less development, and so you see the preservation of sites in those areas. If we compared it to the traditional use of that area, this whole map would be red. The area is very heavily used in the past by Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh people and other First Nations who share this territory. But cultural heritage is not just about archaeology. There's other things like the berry patch that is still growing on the landscape today that was used traditionally by Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh people. That's of cultural heritage importance. We also have spiritual sites that may not have a physical, tangible aspect on the landscape.
Yeah, so at Musqueam we've been working on our definition of cultural heritage. Typically in archaeology, when we talk about cultural heritage, it means the physical remains of people using the landscape. But at Musqueam, that's not what it means. So I'll read you the Musqueam definition. Heritage resources are the tangible and intangible aspects of Musqueam's culture passed down from our ancestors, and to which there is an onus to protect and maintain for successive generations. Heritage resources include, but are not limited to, transformer sites, Locamo sites, named sites, archaeological sites, spiritual use sites, aspects of the landscape integral to Musqueam culture and identity, and associated Hunk Communum language and knowledge. Heritage resources are central to Musqueam's continuity and sense of place. So a much different understanding of culture heritage than the discipline of archaeology sometimes put forward, a much more all-encompassing, inclusive idea of cultural heritage, and one that's very much connected to who Musqueam are today as a people and how they identify and carry themselves in the world.
And so colonization has destroyed a lot of both the tangible and the intangible aspects of cultural heritage. And so one of the main questions we have to ask ourselves is, how do we protect what's left behind? How do we protect the little bits that are left? For the remaining of this talk, Aviva and I are going to be focusing on just the archaeology and not the intangible aspects of cultural heritage, and that's because that's where our background is, and that's where the legislation is in terms of protecting archaeological cultural heritage resources.
Yeah, so one of the ways that we protect what's left is through legislation. There is no federal legislation in Canada to protect archaeological sites. The legislation is provincial, and so it's governed differently province by province. Here in BC, that legislation is called the Heritage Conservation Act, or the HCA. It's a really dry document, but if you want to read it, it's online. The HCA only protects archaeological sites that predate 1846. And at this point, you should be thinking to yourself, why 1846? You know, that has nothing to do with how the First Nations were using the landscape. 1846 is the date when the Oregon Treaty was signed, establishing BC's southern border. So a completely colonialist time marker. And so that's where we're starting from with this HCA. The HCA was developed in 1996, or somewhere around there. I think it was ratified. Under the HCA, the BC Archaeology branch is the provincial body that's the authority. They hold pretty much all of the power in BC over archaeology. When I say protection, when I say HCA is the legislative protection, that is a bit of a misnomer. The HCA actually allows for the alteration or destruction of archaeological sites. All you need is a permit. So it's not as if the sites on the landscape can't be altered. They can, and they very much are altered and destroyed all of the time. It's happening constantly. That's a lot of our job, is dealing with that. And so it's problematic when you have this colonialist body defining what heritage is, what archaeology is, and often these definitions are very narrow and don't encompass all of the things that make up Musqueam or Tsleil-Waututh cultural heritage. They also decide how heritage is managed. They decide who holds authority. So in order to take out a permit to destroy or alter an archaeological site, you have to have a certain amount of experience, and the archaeology branch decides if you're experienced enough. They do have a duty to consult with First Nations, which I'll get into in a little bit, but I think I'm probably not speaking out of turn when I say that the duty to consult is very much superficial. It's not a real, deep discussion back and forth between the nations and the archaeology branch. Often what happens is a project comes up and Musqueam has an issue with it, takes issue with the permit being issued, says that to the archaeology branch, and the archaeology branch says, okay, we've heard your concerns, we've fulfilled our duty to consult, we've issued the permit. And so we'll talk about what's happening now when that happens. It's worth mentioning here that a lot of this presentation focuses on how the archaeology branch is problematic, and that's very apparent to us in our jobs. But the archaeology branch is problematic because it's problematic as an institution. The people that work there are very passionate and very experienced archaeologists who understand that there's a problem in the way that heritage is being governed, but they're pretty handcuffed right now. There's not a lot they can do about it. The branch is chronically understaffed and underfunded, and because the problem is institutional, making institutional change is a full-time job. It is also a lot of what Ginevra and I do, and so for the branch, that institutional change really has to come from leadership. It has to come from the minister and from the premier, and it just hasn't yet. So once the protection of archaeological sites was mandated in the late 90s, and it became illegal to disturb an archaeological site without a permit, developers who wanted to build houses, other buildings in archaeological sites could do so now, but suddenly they needed to hire a professional archaeologist, and a professional archaeologist who was eligible to hold a permit. And so this created a huge industry known as the cultural resource management industry in BC, or the CRM industry. I worked in that industry for close to 10 years before coming over to Musqueam. And it is, in this industry, the firms, archaeological firms, are hired by developers to carry out the obligations set forth by the Heritage Conservation Act. So these firms are what make the developers able to excavate and alter in archaeological sites. It is a $1 billion industry. It's very lucrative and it's growing all the time. As we know, there's a lot of development happening in Vancouver, in the province, and a lot of that in areas that are archaeologically sensitive. There's a chronic shortage of archaeologists, if anybody wants to get into it. Happy to talk about that. There's, I think, about 50 firms in BC, though that's just me thinking about it off the top of my head. And the minority of people practicing archaeology are Indigenous, which is what Ginevra spoke to at the beginning of this presentation. It's very often settler colonialists like Ginevra and I coming into communities and dictating how heritage is managed. So we're working to change that. The picture on the left there looks like a construction site. It's not. Those are archaeologists working on a cultural resource management project. So often on site, we work with these backhoes. We're working against really serious timelines and budgetary constraints. It's not like how you see in the movies with paintbrushes and trowels. We're very much, almost a part of the construction crews in a lot of ways. So the CRM industry has been problematic for a long time, and a lot of the folks in the industry are working to institute change because there's a recognition about a lot of the problematic aspects, and we'll speak to that a little bit in this presentation. So I'm going to take you through the typical model for managing heritage in the CRM industry. Then this presentation, a lot of it's going to be focused on how we're changing that and on one particular project we're working on together to change that. So in the typical model of CRM archaeology, you have these three major players. Your proponent, so the person who's looking to build a house, your consulting firm, your CRM firm, and the BC Archaeology branch. The proponent very much controls the budget and the schedule. They hire the consulting firm who are there to fulfill the requirements of the Heritage Conservation Act. The consulting firm works with the BC Archaeology branch, which is the legislative body, to determine appropriate methods for investigating if a site is on a property, for investigating how that site might be impacted by the proposed development, for interpreting results, and for reporting back to the BC Archaeology branch and to the proponents. Then we have down here the First Nations, who are consulted. We are consulted on the methods. We are sometimes involved in the field work, but not really as the experts. The consulting firms are considered the experts. And where I work at Musqueam, I have a coworker who's been doing archaeology since 1999. I've been doing this for about 10 years. He can't hold a permit, I can. So just thinking about who's an expert and why someone is an expert is a really important discussion. A lot of the archaeology consulting firms have recognized that there is a lack of First Nations voice and control and management of the heritage, and they recognize that this is not the way they want to be doing archaeology anymore. So nowadays we collaborate more and more with consulting firms, which is really nice to see. A couple of the firms are in the audience today, and they are people we work very closely on projects. And a lot of this change has come about because I think there's a new generation of archaeologists coming up with really amazing ideas and inspired by people who have done incredible work in the past, but a lot of it is because of what's been happening socially and culturally in BC and worldwide in the past 30 years. So to give you guys a bit of that context, I'll take you through a couple of those key points. So in 1982, Section 35 was included in the Canadian Constitution, and Section 35 recognizes and affirms Aboriginal rights and title, so right to use the land and to the land itself. It also laid out that the province is legally required to consult and accommodate First Nations on decisions that might impact Aboriginal interest, and these include archaeological projects that fall within provincial jurisdiction. Then moving forward to 1997, we had a very pivotal court case, the Delgamuukw case, which marked the first time in legal history that the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that that title existed. So it was established with the Constitution, the change to the Constitution in 1982, and then it was ratified in 1997. There have been other court cases since Delgamuukw that have built on this. Chilcotin is one. Those court cases have also brought to light how oral history can and should be used as evidence in court. Ginevra was talking about First Nations people being historians here, and they are historians. They have very detailed records. They're oral histories, so a lot of them aren't written down the same way other civilizations' histories are, but that doesn't make them any less valid and any less true. So these two events in history really laid out the province's and the province's duty to consult on projects. Then if we jump ahead another few years, that takes us to the United Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This is a document that's being referenced more and more, and if you haven't read it, please do. It's very short. It's very foundational to the work we do, but also is likely foundational to how everybody in this room carries themselves on the landscape and understands how First Nations people have been impacted. I'm going to take you through. I have my little pocket UNDRIP. It's called UNDRIP by those of us who use it quite often. I'm going to take you through the opening statement from this just so you understand how pivotal and serious this document is. Indigenous peoples globally continue to face dispossession of their lands and resources, discrimination, forced assimilation, and other grave human rights abuses. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is the most comprehensive international human rights instrument to specifically address their economic, social, cultural, political, civil, spiritual, and environmental rights. In its own words, the Declaration sets out minimal standards necessary for the dignity, survival, and well-being of Indigenous peoples. So a very, very powerful document. In this document, one of the articles, actually a couple of the articles, but one in particular, speaks to archaeology, speaks to the rights of Indigenous people to maintain and protect their own cultural heritage, including archaeological sites. So this is a right established by the United Nations. So if we move forward to 2013, this is when archaeology in the Lower Mainland and in BC started to really become part of news media and part of the general public's understanding of how development was impacting First Nations rights. Tsesnam, the village of Tsesnam, is known in English as Marpole. It's at the foot of the Arthur Lang Bridge. It's a National Historic Site and one of the largest and most studied villages in BC. It's also one of Musqueam's primary village, and it is an ancestral burial ground, as most of First Nations villages are. There's a lot of literature on the site, including a really amazing documentary put out by Musqueam called The City Before the City. So I'm not going to take you through too much about the site itself, but just to let you know that it's seen extensive destruction over the years. A lot of development has impacted the site. And back around a little bit before 2013, a developer purchased one of the lots within the site boundaries with the intent of building a condominium. He knew it was within site boundaries and hired an archaeologist who applied for a permit from the archaeology branch. Musqueam stepped in and said, absolutely not. We oppose to any development happening in that area. We know there are ancestors buried there. It should be unlawful to excavate a cemetery, but the branch issued the permit anyways. And so the archaeological investigation started. The archaeologists went in to see just what was there, which they could have just asked Musqueam, because Musqueam knows what's in their villages. But through that, they did discover ancestral burials. When that happened, Musqueam became, even more upset, understandably. There was no meaningful consultation. There was none of that back and forth discussion. And so Musqueam ended up holding 24-hour vigils and protests for over 200 days. Lots of members of the public came out. Traffic was stopped at a couple points. And eventually, because of this, and because of the public outcry, actually, the province suspended permits, and eventually the province and Musqueam together purchased that property. Building on that, the Grace Islet case that happened just a little bit later. This project started in 2006, but really came to a head in 2014, 2015. Almost the exact same story. A developer bought a small island off of Ganges Harbor, Salt Spring, to build a house. The First Nations knew that there were ancestors buried there, opposed the archaeological study, opposed the building of the house. The permits were issued anyways. Again, there were protests, and again, it ended up, luckily, in a really good situation where the province ended up buying the property. Which brings us to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out of, as Ginevra was talking about, what happened during the residential schools era. I'm not sure if everybody knows this, but it was a surprise to me to learn this. The last residential school in Canada closed down in 1996. This is not something that happened hundreds of years ago. This happened very recently. So this is a past that's still very much impacting people who we work with, people in the community. And the commission set out to settle class action lawsuits brought because of what happened during the residential school era. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission called on all levels of government to adopt the principles of UNDRIP, of the United Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and to achieve the goals of UNDRIP across the board. So it's important to note that there has been a lot that's brought us up to this place we're at now, to this place where it feels very much to me like we are at a time of great change in archaeology. The two archaeological projects I talked about, Cessnom and Grace Islet, the developers did nothing illegal. They applied for permits from the archaeology branch. They were granted permits from the archaeology branch. So at this point, it should bring into question, how can you build on top of a cemetery? There's no way that we would see a condo going up at Mountain View. So how is it that we can see condos going up at Cessnom, at Grace Islet? It's also because of these things, Cessnom, Grace Islet, and the TRC, that the public really began to understand what was happening, began to understand that, you can't build a condo at Mountain View, but you can at Cessnom, and how is that fair, and how is that ethical? So now we're at a place in 2019 where things are changing, and so Ginevra's going to take it from here.
Thanks. So learning what we have learned over the past few decades, with some examples that Aviva just gave, where do we go from here? What would be the goal model for heritage management in BC? And what that looks like is giving First Nations sovereignty over cultural heritage resource management. It seems like a no-brainer. Like, First Nations they have a right to manage their own heritage. Building First Nations capacity is a main thing. So I talked about how Aviva and I ideally want to work ourselves out of jobs by building capacity at the nation, so that First Nations folks can take over and be managers of their own heritage. There'll be training opportunities, education, employment in cultural resource management, and even economic development opportunities through the development of CRM businesses owned by the nations. And part of this is changing the colonial narrative. So archaeology is a colonial endeavor. The majority of us are settlers, and we're talking about First Nations heritage. We've seen when projects include First Nations archaeologists that they're so much more well-rounded, and we fully understand the importance of some of these heritage sites. So I can only imagine when First Nations are really the leaders in taking care of and talking about and researching their own cultural heritage. And this is happening already, so it's not entirely new. And First Nations sovereignty over heritage resources will support a reconnection to culture and support language revitalization. The Truth and Reconciliation specifically calls on all levels of government to adopt UNDRIP. And so we're hoping, that hasn't quite happened yet, but we're hoping moving forward it'll be taken more seriously by all levels of government. So Aviva showed this current model earlier, where we have the proponent hiring an archaeology consulting firm who then applies for a permit through the BC Archaeology branch, and then there's a little bit of consultation with First Nations. So that's currently how it goes. What we're proposing is this, and you may notice that it is just flipped on its head. We're hoping to have First Nations at the top, having sovereignty over the study and management of heritage resources, working together with the BC Archaeology branch for that legislation piece. And the archaeology consulting firms working on behalf of the proponent for the project are going to carry out the work either with or on behalf of the First Nations, and this is going to be guided by the methods set forward by First Nations and the BC Archaeology branch. So this is our goal. And it might be a little bit difficult to get there because we'll be like tipping over the whole system as we know it. Oops. Oh, did I go the right way? Yeah. There we go. Okay. So we've created kind of like a mid-step in getting there. And it's based on First Nations building relationships with local regulators. So local regulators, I'm talking about City of Vancouver, BC Hydro, Metro Vancouver, Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, all of whom have their own regulations for various development that happens in the Vancouver area. Through the relationships we're building, the First Nations are able to gain a little bit more power over the projects that happen. And so what this would look like is First Nations and local regulators working together, First Nations, putting forth exactly how they want heritage to be managed on a certain project, and then that being communicated to the BC Archaeology branch and the consulting firms in order to see that through. One example of how we're implementing this like mid-step between our goal, our current management model and our goal model is through the Locarno Beach Management Plan. And so this is a collaborative plan between Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and the City of Vancouver. It's a comprehensive management plan that is proactive as opposed to reactive. So with projects, a lot of the time a development is occurring, maybe you accidentally come across an archaeological site, and the nations are notified, and all of a sudden you're having to figure out, what do we do? Maybe there's ancestral remains there. How do we manage this? How do we take care of it? And it's kind of like on the fly and in the moment. And what we're trying to do is be more proactive about it, setting exact management guidelines that the nations want to see, how they want heritage to be managed at this specific site. And it's helping us, it's basically helping both the First Nations and the city manage how development is going to occur within a very sensitive archaeological site. And it's putting more of the control back into the hands of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations.
I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about the Locarno Beach site. So as you can see from this map, it's very close to where we are now. Most of you have probably visited it, maybe taken your dogs there. The site itself is a very small polygon, but the village would have extended kilometers, likely from Spanish Banks to Jericho. The Hunkaminam name for this village is Ayamuch. It is a very complex archaeology site, occupied for at least 3,300 years, with the surrounding areas being used for hunting, fishing, resource procurement, all of those things. Like the village of Tsesnam that I talked about earlier, it's a site recognized Canada-wide, and like Tsesnam, it is an ancestral burial ground. It is a cemetery, and there are ancestors interred there today. So we focused on Locarno Beach for this management plan for a number of reasons. The Locarno Beach site has seen a long history of destruction, partially through archaeological investigation. These next two photos are photos from Charles Borden's 1948 work and 1966 work. Charles Borden, for the non-archaeologists, is considered the father of Canadian archaeology. So you can see there he's got some trenches on the left and another wall profile on the right. All of the projects I've worked on at this site have come across ancestors, and most of the projects that have been done through CRM or through academic research have come across ancestral burials. This video I'm going to play you is one of those reactive projects that Ginevra was mentioning that we so often have to deal with. What you'll see in this video is that's Richard, one of my coworkers, a Musqueam archaeologist. He's filling up buckets with dirt, or matrix as we say in archaeology. And that material is from the Locarno Beach site. It now is at Musqueam, so that's Musqueam in the background. That is at Musqueam because in the late 90s, a homeowner wanted to build a new house at Locarno Beach, was told he had to hire an archaeologist to do an investigation to see what was exactly there in his house footprint. The archaeologist did an investigation to the archaeology branch's standards, which just asked him to do a minimal amount of removal of the material that was there, a very small percentage. And the rest of it, the archaeologist and the archaeology branch agreed could be excavated to make room for the house footprint and could be carted off to the dump, which is when Leona Sparrow, who is one of my mentors at Musqueam, stepped in and said, absolutely not. That material contains my ancestors, our ancestors, it contains their belongings. There's no way that it's going to a dump. And so instead, a compromise was reached. And I use compromise loosely. A compromise was reached where the material was dumped half at Squamish and half at Musqueam for us to deal with at our own expense. So I use it now as a training tool to train new archaeologists and as a collaborative project. But this project is one of many similar projects that have been happening at Locarno Beach for years and years, and that the nations have been reacting to as development and houses being built down there slowly chip away piece at a time at the burial ground, slowly remove one ancestor at a time. And it got to a point a few years ago where Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh put down our feet and said, no more. We're not allowing these projects to happen one at a time. We're not allowing ancestors to be removed. And so we together, the three nations, will develop a management plan that doesn't stop development, but helps the development work around what we know is there and helps make sure that the heritage is managed in a way that's respectful. So how do these projects happen? This is a typical workflow for an archaeological project. So typically a proponent, someone building a house, someone building this house that I was just talking about, applies to the city for a permit, is notified that there are archaeological concerns and that they have to fulfill those archaeological concerns as outlined by the Heritage Conservation Act. So they will hire an archaeological consulting firm who will then contact the archaeology branch and obtain a permit. At this point, First Nations are consulted in that we're given that permit so that we can review the methods and comment on them. Again, often those comments aren't really input into the permit. Then field work is carried out by that consulting firm. Often First Nations are involved in that field work. That is one area that CRM archaeology has been really strong in for a very long time. And then a report is written on the findings, and the First Nations are sent that report to review and comment on. The main point of showing you this workflow is that this process can happen whether or not the First Nations are involved in a meaningful way. We hold little control over what happens when these projects are going in and impacting archaeological sites. Oh yeah, then it's over to you.
So in comparison, we're going to show you how we anticipate things to work under the Locarno Beach Management Plan. So again, a proponent applies to the city for a development permit. Oops, I went backwards. There we go. This is then reviewed by the Locarno Beach Management Plan Committee. And so this committee consists of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, as well as the City of Vancouver as the local regulator. So we'll review the project that is proposed to occur within the Locarno Beach site and determine whether or not we're fine with it going ahead. The next step is that an archaeology consulting firm is hired, and they're working with the ARC branch again to apply for the permit and develop the appropriate methods. But through the Locarno Beach Management Plan, the nations would have already set forth the preferred methods that the nations are okay with occurring on projects within the site. And so again, this stage, we also have approval from the Locarno Beach Committee. When archaeological fieldwork takes place, First Nations are still going to be involved in the fieldwork. It's necessary for them to be there. It's not an optional thing. And again, we're including an approval stage from the committee. And again, same with the reporting. And what we're trying to do here is make First Nations an integral part of each step in the workflow. There's not this like, the work cannot continue if First Nations are not involved. And so that was, again, through First Nations developing relationships with local regulators that help give the nations power in order to enact those approvals about the project.
Yeah, so the management plan is, we're taking you through it very high level. A lot of that is because it's very complex, you know, getting all of these folks together in a room to talk about, you know, how a development will work is no small feat. It's also very high level because we're still working on it right now. It's very much in process and has been for a very long time, but we're close to finishing it, right? Yeah. It's also just one of many ways we're working to establish First Nations sovereignty over cultural heritage resources. This is a list of other ways that we're doing that. We are bringing up the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People at every opportunity we can, and reminding the provincial government that under this declaration and the Truth and Reconciliations Commission's calls to action, they have a responsibility to return control and sovereignty of First Nations heritage to First Nations people. As Ginevra spoke about, we're building capacity internally. We are also forming partnerships with institutions, which speaks to the work that I'm doing with the Indigenous Science Cluster. You know, the Indigenous Science Cluster is really powerful for Musqueam because it gives us access to all of the amazing tools at UBC and all of the amazing researchers who know how to use those tools. And so at any point, if I get some direction from Musqueam about something that Musqueam wants to look at or study more, The science cluster is always here to say, yep, we'll help with that. And all of the researchers in the science cluster come without any agenda, without any of their own academic agenda. So they're doing this research and partnering with us with the understanding that it's something that the nations need. We also partner with proponents, CRM firms, as Ginevra talked about, local regulators. We now have a very strong relationship with the City of Vancouver, and it's taken a while to get there, but this plan would not be happening without the city's support, and we would not have the power we have without that local regulator saying to the general public, nope, this is the way archaeology is being done, and it's being done in a way that's respectful of First Nations. Internally, we're building policies, management plans, permits. Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh have our own heritage permitting requirements separate from the Heritage Conservation Act, which is not recognized by the province. But most consultants, most archaeologists working in our territories abide by our permits and our permit requirements because they know that's good practice, because they know it's the ethical thing to do, even if the province won't recognize it. We're working on changing legislation. It's an uphill battle most days, but it is kind of the big end goal. And we're also working on redefining a lot of the language and the terms used. So thinking about what is archaeology, what is cultural heritage, what constitutes truth, what is knowledge, is the Western scientific way of obtaining truth the only way of obtaining truth, or are there other ways of obtaining truth? At Musqueam, we don't refer to artifacts as artifacts. They are called belongings because they still have connection to the Musqueam people. They belong to the Musqueam people. They are not things of the past. They are not things for museums. I know I personally work a lot at using Hunk Communum in everything that I do. I've been studying Hunk Communum for about a year, and part of that comes out of my direction that I've had from folks in the community. That cultural heritage isn't just the archaeology. I can't just work in this silo without understanding the impacts and the connections to everything else, including Hunk Communum. Do you want me to? Oh, wait, it is mine, isn't it? Oh, yeah, it is mine. Okay. So why is this important? I mean, it's important to Ginevra and I because this is our work, this is our passion. It's also important because establishing sovereignty over cultural heritage is the right and responsibility of all First Nations. As outlined in the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. It's also one of the principles of reconciliation, and that word is used a lot, and sometimes makes me a little bit cringy because, you know, folks use it without, I think, really understanding what reconciliation is. And a part of that is because reconciliation is very complex and nuanced. It's about building a relationship. It's also about recognizing the power imbalances and how that have affected First Nations and taking that every day into ourselves to understand how we benefit from that power and benefit of that power imbalance, especially as settler colonialists.
So why should you care about First Nations sovereignty? One of the main things is this is your city. I think that everyone who lives here should have some basic understanding about the First Nations history here, because you're also part of the reconciliation process. I encourage everybody to consider how they can include First Nations in your various projects and not just as a consultation. How do you include First Nations at the development stage? How do you allow them to be at the tables? And part of that is, I mentioned earlier that capacity is an issue. So how do you build First Nations participation in your various projects into your budget for that project? That is an important part. And there's things that you can do in your day-to-day life that can be part of the reconciliation process, and a large part of that is going to be just understanding. Learn more about local First Nations, increase your understanding about them. Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh people really want you to be able to enjoy the cultures in a respectful way. Tsleil-Waututh people, my coworkers always say, Tsleil-Waututh people are here to stay. We're not going anywhere. Settler people, we recognize that this is also your home. You're not going anywhere, so let's find ways to work together, to collaborate, to have fun.
Yeah, so as the HCA's heritage legislation, it is at the mercy of whichever political party is voted in that can anytime make the legislation stronger or completely gut it. So everybody in this room, when you are going to vote, that is something I look for in candidates. I look at their understanding of First Nations issues. I look at how they're speaking to the reconciliatory process. You know, are they just glossing it over? Are they talking about it, you know, to drum up public support, or do they really understand the issues at hand? People in this room maybe buy property, maybe build on property, all of that impacting a landscape that is integral to Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh peoples and culture. I'm not going to take you through these articles in depth, but these articles, all of them I think are dated from the last 3 years, and they're, if you go home and Google BC Archaeology Court or BC Archaeology Legal, it will pop, a bunch of articles will pop up about some of the legal battles that have been taking place in archaeology in the past 5 or so years. All of these battles are calling into question some really important and difficult questions. So things like, who does own the land? Who owns the ancestors that are interred in the land? Who has the right to remove and disturb those ancestors? This all relates back to the idea of this territory being unceded territory. Things like, you know, how do we involve First Nations in those difficult discussions? And so part of my hope is that when you take away from this, projector went off. We only had one slide left. It's okay, we don't need it with this slide. So I'm hoping that part of this presentation, you take away some discussion points to, you know, have with your family at home, or when you're hearing people talk about, you know, development happening on the landscape, you bring in these perspectives and these questions about, you know, how these developments are happening and who has control. First Nations sovereignty over heritage is more than just a right to First Nations people themselves. And I'll read a quote from my friend and mentor and Musqueam councillor Morgan Guerin about this management plan and about the importance of it to him culturally and personally. When I talked to him about it, he said, "This management plan is my connection to my ancestors, my land, and they are connected and are connected to me and to all Musqueam people. As a descendant, I am a steward of this land, a caretaker for the loved ones who came before me, just as they were the caretakers of this land and the ones who came before them. It is my responsibility, and I am responsible for this land and the ancestors, not just to protect them and myself and my identity, but to protect these places and their connection, the connection they hold to us, and they're an integral part of our world for future generations." Hi, Tsepka. Oh, big thank you also to the city who's hiding out in the back, who were a big part in funding the work that we do. Our hands are up to them because, you know, it's not very often that we collaborate with folks who say, sure, have money, go at it, do whatever you want and come back to us when you have a product, and the city has really done that. They've let us take the reins and has just completely funded the project. Also, big thank you to Allison and the Indigenous Research, and Rye and Eric and the Indigenous Research Cluster, and Green College for hosting us.